when I was younger, I loved the Bible. My grandmother, Ardenia Churn, she was from the Deep South, and she was in her 50s, late 50s, maybe early 60s, and she gave me a leather bound Bible when I was probably about 6 or 7 years old. And I used to read Genesis and I loved it. And the story of Genesis was so majestical, at least the beginning chapters of Genesis where it talks about creation always moved me. And I would never really go too much further past that as a young kid. But I always felt like God was real. I always felt like there's got to be a creator, that things don't just create themselves. I believed that as a young kid. And even though I didn't have too much more knowledge about God than that, I felt pretty confident about that part. And as I grew older, I would go to church with my mother, and the experience was pretty hollow to me personally. I mean, it wasn't to my mom, of course, she was very moved. And I saw many of our people, black people, and they were worshiping and doing what they do. But I never was too much moved. I liked the girls in the church. It was nice. Um, I would go to my grandmother's church, and I'd feel pretty much the same. I mean, the messages were pretty consistent. It's Baptist church, and but for me, it was more so about the girls that I could meet, and not too much more, to be honest. And then when I got to be about 17, 18, I could make my own decisions about the issue, and I pretty much never went to church. I'd always felt like church was a sort of powerless place. I didn't feel too much power within the walls of the church, and the members of the church, although I liked them because they were people of the community, um, I didn't think I liked them necessarily because of Jesus or because of their relationship with Jesus. I just liked them as people. They were cool. I liked them just like I liked people outside of the church. So I liked a lot of different people because of their personalities and who they were. But that was it. The church didn't seem to hold a lot of power. As I became political and understanding about conscious issues, I learned about the Black Panthers, Malcolm X, Marcus Garvey, um, learned a lot more about the slavery realities. I became so much more conscientious. Music like Public Enemy, moved me. KRS One, and of course the Last Poets and Gil Scott Heron and so on and so forth. But just a lot of different stuff was, Bob Marley. These things were moving me and being introduced to my life when I was around 18 or so. And then I really started to see the church as not only powerless, but also a tool, a tool to pacify, basically, people of all races, but especially black people who had a reason to be pacified, seeing that they had been oppressed for hundreds of years. The chances of them revolting and rising up were more strong than the chances of white people in general, who had more of a privileged life in comparison. So the need for religion to be a pacifier, I felt that that was a logical thing, and the Bible, and especially the passages that were being taught from it, were able to pacify people and make them not think about the plight of others, make them only think about justice and righteousness in heaven, nothing on earth. And it was the perfect tool to sort of keep people pacified and in their own little bubble. And then I had I had met my queen, and we fell in love. We had amazing talks with one another and really got to know one another. And I felt like she was one of the most loving people that I ever met. Had an incredible heart, had an incredible spirit, and she and I were, striving to find our way as a couple and spiritually. And so we practiced Yoruba. We practiced, and in all fairness to Yoruba, we didn't practice it fully. I mean, we knew what we knew, and we practiced what we could. We mixed that with things that we felt were true in other ways. So we mixed it with a lot of different things that we had read and things that we felt were just powerful. And so it was, at the end of the day, it was a gumbo of different sort of spiritual thoughts. And we felt pretty strongly about those things. And we would do things, go out to parks and talk about our spirit, talk about our spirituality, and put our prayers into the water, and via like notes that we would write and put it out into the water. And these various things were our ways to try to connect with God. And my wife, before we got married, actually, we were just dating, she got pregnant by me. And we had our first son. And at that time, the spiritual walk became more, basically we realized that we needed to be more specific. Okay, what exactly do we believe? Because now we've brought another person into this world, which is a miracle in and of itself. And it's a godly experience in and of itself. You're seeing a new life. I never forget, I'm sure some people can relate to this if you've had kids, being at the hospital and we were delivering our son. They were delivering our son. And when we held him in our arms, me and Yolanda, my wife, were like, okay, this is amazing, but what are we going to do with this amazing gift? Like, we were thinking to ourselves, are they going to let us leave this hospital with this human being? Because like most new parents, you don't have a clue as to what you're doing. You have no clue. And that was us. And the reality of raising a child, it makes you think about who you are, what you believe, and what are you going to instill inside of this human being, this precious, amazing creation. What are you going to instill into this being? And that's where me and my queen were at. And so we needed to really get more specific. Or at least we felt the need to do that. And so a woman at that same general time, a woman that I auditioned to sing with me came and started talking about her church. She was a great singer, fantastic singer, still is. And she got the gig to sing with me. We went overseas. She started talking about Christianity. And I told her flat out, Christianity is powerless. And I used to really get on her heavily. And so anyway, we're overseas. And I share this story in my book. I have a book called What is Success? I'd like y'all to check it out. It's on my website, brotherspeech.com. And I share this story in my book, so I won't go into it all the way, but I'll share it a little bit. I was overseas with her. This is her first time, not only overseas, her first time pretty much out of the state of Georgia. She had been a couple places like Mississippi, which is where she was from, but she had never been anywhere. And she's not a famous singer. And so, we're in Holland. I think we were in Amsterdam, actually. Packed crowd, really great show. And I get on stage, and the crowd starts screaming, Nisha, Nisha. And this is the woman that I just auditioned. This is her first time performing overseas, first time, not a famous woman. And I'm like singing the show, I'm doing the show, and I'm saying to myself while I'm singing my lyrics, who the heck, how do they know about this girl Nisha? And long story short, I share more about it in the book, but it was really funny because I'm struggling on stage. I'm like, how are they screaming her name? She's the new chick that I just hired. And I'm the star. And this was my solo career, by the way. This is not Arrested Development. I'm doing a solo thing. And for those that don't know, I have had a very successful solo career and overseas. And so anyway, so it was really interesting to me. And I got backstage, and there's this crowd of people waiting for Nisha. people with big old smiles and white, black, all different races. And I'm like, what the heck is going on? So I go over there and I meet them, and they say they're from Nisha's church. And I'm still baffled because Nisha hadn't traveled anywhere. So they're like, Nisha's church, y'all could not have met Nisha. She's not even been here. Number one. And number two, yeah, she's in some church back in Atlanta, but how do y'all know her? And the truth is, they didn't know her. They just heard about her. And there was this community of people. They called themselves Christians, and more so disciples. And there was this community of people that was supporting Nisha, even though they had never met her. They just heard she was coming over. They heard she was a disciple of Jesus Christ. And so they came to support her. And I remember thinking at that moment that I have spent money for promotion. I've spent money on agents and managers and promotion teams and so on and so forth, and in my career. And all of that was to strive to get people to understand what I'm doing and to support what I'm doing and come out to shows, support the music. And this woman did none of that. And she had a power. She had a community that I knew nothing about. And that was the first time I was perplexed about Christianity in a real way. I was like, what is this? What is this community of people that are willing to get out of their house, hire babysitters for those that are young, just get out of their house, pay money, go to a concert, and support somebody that they've never met. They don't even know their name. I mean, they hardly know her name. And that was Christianity. And that was something that I felt was really powerful. I was like, that is true. That's something that's really moving to me. And so I started for the first time opening up my heart and my mind to better understand what is Christianity in a bigger way. I knew that it was powerless from what I had seen, but what I had seen with Nisha was not powerless. It was powerful. And it wasn't just because they supported her. It was this camaraderie. She was able to live at their house, any of their homes. There was a unity, a nation, a world that was very moving. And so I agreed to go out to Nisha's church. Me and my queen, we both went. First time I went, it was mainly white people. And I love white people. I love black people. I love people of all races. That wasn't the issue. But I do come from my understandings of our oppression and so on and so forth, and especially understanding that religion has been used as a tool to pacify. So when I saw all white people, my red flag went up, and then I said, okay, well, let me just see what's happening. But I noticed a lot of things. There was, people had similar kind of cars as each other. There was definitely a culture. People dressed very similarly to each other. It was a culture. It was a thing where you had a certain look, a vibe, a feel. You spoke similarly, and all of that stuff was a turnoff. It was red flags for me, but I still went. And anyway, we heard the sermon and so on and so forth, and I left there. I wasn't very moved by it. And I was like, I told my queen, I was like, this was whack. I hated it. It's this white thing, and it's just all of these smiley, happy people, but they're not addressing issues. And, this is just, it's pacifism. And it just have a lot of people that drank the Kool-Aid. So that's what I felt the first time I went. Then, for some reason, and this is, I felt it was the Spirit that told me to go back the next week. So my queen and I went back and hated it again. Same exact feel that I had the first time. But again, the Spirit inside of me, told me just still keep your eyes open, speech. Don't close your eyes to this. There's something here. And so even though I didn't like the service, a man that I've become best friends with, a fantastic guy, Jewish heritage, but a Christian at this point, came up to me and said, hey, would you like to study the Bible? And even though I hated the church service, I said, yes, of course. And so I did. And we set up the Bible study for the next night. That was Monday night. And so here I am, the cocky guy that I can be, I'm like, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna study the Bible with these cats, but I'm gonna teach them a few things about Christianity. So I started brushing up on my Christianity. I read a few books that I had already had in my library about Christianity. One of them was called More Than Just a Carpenter by Josh McDowell, I think, and I opened it up, started reading it, and this was Sunday night, and the book was really short, and so that was the one book that I went over that I was able to read the whole thing in pretty much an hour or so. And I got sick to my stomach. And these are all the things that I feel God was doing to me to help me to be ready for the things that He wanted to set me on a journey with. I got sick to my stomach because I started to realize in this book the logic behind Jesus Christ. I started to wipe away all of the things that I had heard about Jesus Christ and all of the lifestyles that were hypocritical for those that were under Jesus Christ. And I started to see Jesus Christ as a person that was on earth, that lived at a particular time in history, that claimed very specific things about himself. And I started to think about whether or not these things are real or false. And I came to the conclusion that they must have been real. And it got me sick to my stomach because I realized how wrong I had been about Jesus. I don't think I was totally wrong about the church and the things that I'd seen in my past. I was wrong about Jesus. I was wrong about God and how He does have a plan to come into our lives and to help us to navigate our time here on earth, but also to navigate the spiritual realm, which is what we will spend most of our time within, the spiritual realm. We spend about 80 years or whatever here, and then after that, it's the unknown for most of us, and then for some of us, we believe that it is a life after this that is not with the flesh and the body and all of that, and there's a spiritual world. And that's what we'll spend, whether eternity or a certain amount of time in, that is where we'll be. And so this Jesus Christ was talking about these both planes, the plane here and how it affects the plane there, the plane on earth, the flesh, and the plane in the spirit. And so I was very moved and I was very ready for this study, but God got me ready. Like, I got so sick. And that sickness, that realization that I was deadly wrong about someone that I was writing off, but in truth, he was for me. He was revolutionary in a way that Marcus Garvey or Malcolm X or Denmark Vesey, anybody, that it was another level. It was a revolution of not only the human being, but the soul. It was fundamentally changing the way you think about the world. And that moved me. And it felt right. And so I studied the Bible. There was things that I had to set aside in order to really try to get the deep lessons. So in other words, there were some things that didn't totally make sense to me, and I set those things aside for a moment to try to understand the deeper truths of what the scriptures were saying. And I'm going to put the same scriptures that I studied in order to understand Jesus. I'm going to put those on my channel real soon. So be looking out for that. So I started studying these scriptures, and night after night. So these brothers were great. It was probably about 5 brothers. I won't name them now, but wonderful guys. And for free, they came to my home every night, and we studied the scriptures for probably about 2 to 3 hours a night. Usually starting about 7 o'clock at night, and we studied until at least 10, somewhere in there. And we studied the scriptures. I asked tons of questions. I had a lot of questions. And I was able to get deep and try to understand as much as I could about scripture. And long story short, I became a Christian about, I think, 4 months or so after we started studying the Bible, maybe 5. I decided I wanted to be a Christian, and I became one. And that was in 1996, December 8th. I got baptized, and my sins were forgiven, and I had received the grace of Jesus, and I received his blood, which it cleansed me, and I became a disciple of Jesus. And as soon as I was baptized, I then had my wife in the baptism, and I baptized her. So we literally got baptized right after each other, December 8th, 1996. And so a whole new life was opened up to me. I had to put aside a lot of my teachings about consciousness because at this point I wanted to focus on what Jesus had to say. So there was a lot of things that were coming at me, a lot of friends in the conscious community that I was very cool with, very close to, that were, telling me, don't do this, don't do that. This is whack. This is, you don't want to do this. And all of that stuff I had to put to the side because I really wanted to focus on what God was telling me at this point. And I'm not disappointed that I did these things. They were necessary. And I've been a Christian now, a disciple, for over 22 years. I'll be 23 years this December. And I don't regret any of that. It was very, very powerful. It was the most moving community I've ever been a part of. It was very, very close-knit and very beautiful. What anybody who's ever experienced Christianity in real life, not just from a biblical and theoretical perspective, but actually have lived the life of a functional, working Christian community, church. A church is church, all that means is community. It doesn't mean buildings and all that stuff. I hate when this happens where someone calls me and I have to start all over. So the ecclesia is the church. It's a group of people moving in the same direction. As simple as that. I want to think of it as a revolution that's moving in the same direction. I don't regret any of those moves. They were very important to me. And so over time, ecclesias, churches, because it's filled with human beings being hopefully moved by the Holy Spirit, these human beings still start to make mistakes and they start doing stupid things, and it happens. We humans can do stupid things, especially in comparison to what the Spirit calls us to do. We have this flesh, we have these minds, we have the external things that are coming at us from different sides, and we make stupid decisions. So the church does that as well. And the church started to fall apart in various ways, and it made it much harder for me to see the same power that I once seen inside of this particular church that I was in. Meanwhile, some other external things started to happen that were very, very compelling for me. One of them was Obama became president, first black president in the United States. It brought out a lot of sentiments from my white brothers and sisters within the church that were at first just disheartening to me. And after a while, they became discouraging for me, which maybe is the same thing. But at first, it was minor disheartening, and then after a while, it was deeply discouraging. Some of the things that they were, white brothers and sisters within the church were condemning Obama for, I felt was very harsh and very morally judgmental. And then over time, police brutality started to be taped a lot, and that's with the technology, having the cell phones out, and everybody was filming police brutality and police killings. And I started to notice this huge divide in the church where black people were scared scared for their lives, because many of us were young, black, and knew that what the police were considering to be dangerous could be any of us, having a hood on, walking through a neighborhood at night. Or many of us had kids, and we realized that this could be our kids. Many of us had tall, dark kids who, whether for whatever reasons, had fashion statements of having their pants down a little low, or wearing a hood, or it just things that started to really concern the black community was not concerning the white community in the church whatsoever. And I knew that would likely be the case in the world outside of the church, but inside of the church, I was hoping that the Spirit would have moved the church to the extent of when one member mourns, the rest of the members mourn. That community that I was talking about earlier with Nisha, being together, being one, that when black people were scared out of their wits about police brutality and police killings, that the church would also follow suit because it was affecting black people no matter who they were. It didn't affect just black people of a certain class, black people of a certain neighborhood, a certain city. It was worldwide, especially nationwide, and it was affecting blacks because of their skin color. The church was extremely silent about the issue. And so the church just wanted to go forward with sort of the jolly lives that everyone was living, and it reminded me of the movie Black Panther with Wakanda, where people in Wakanda were very safe. Everybody was happy, and the dilemma was, do we let the rest of the world know about this amazing thing we have and risk it being tampered with, or do we keep this amazing thing to ourselves? Well, the church had some really great things going. The relationships were amazing. We were really close to one another. We were helping one another. We were being honest with one another. But there was a divide that was happening, and it was based on race. The blacks were feeling a huge pressure, seeing that we were being physically oppressed again. We remember it. It's in our DNA to remember the terrorism that we were put through in this nation and in other nations throughout the West, through the Jim Crow era, through the Civil Rights era. Not even going to talk about slavery, which is in our DNA as well. So all of that trauma, all of those generational traumas are still in our blood as black people. And so we were feeling these things, and yet the church was not acknowledging any of it. And that's when I realized that racism had truly entered the walls of the church. Not just at that moment, it had already entered the walls, and I just was not aware of it because I purposely had sort of put aside my X-ray vision goggles, or whatever you want to look at it as, that would have normally seen these things easily, but I put it aside to try to focus on my spirituality. And I became very disheartened, very discouraged. And then there was numerous things that were happening even within my personal life with the church, where I was dealing with various leaders that were white, and they're talking to me in a very belittling way. They were talking to me and my partners who were also black. They were talking to us like we were children. And there was some things that I started to notice. So then the Trump era came in, and it got to a fever pitch, the differences between white and black life in general. I think where it really plays into is that the church, when it's properly done, and the church, when it's truly functional, is a family that needs to be closer than even your blood relatives. Jesus says, if you give up your blood relatives for me, I'll give you hundreds and thousands of blood relatives, in a sense. I'm paraphrasing. But long story short is that as blacks within the Christian church, we can no longer confide in certain issues that really, really affect us and are very important to us, because our white counterparts or other races of counterparts, they were basically not caring about these issues in any deep way, and they weren't educated enough to even give advice or spiritual insight on the issues. And so they would give sort of pat spiritual answers, and it would only feel like you're basically simplifying something that's actually not simple, and it's not small. And so blacks were sort of forced in many cases to talk only amongst ourselves, and that's when you started to have a real difference in the church. I could go much deeper, but I have said that a lot of our white brothers and sisters within the Christian movement, and really white brothers and sisters, period, should look at a book called White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. I think it's a good start for understanding, it's called White Fragility. And it's a good book to understand how fragile many whites have been conditioned to be when it comes to talking about issues of race, and how deep the problems are with race, how fundamental they are in this country and in the world. You have to be educated on that in order to, and I'm talking to my white brothers and sisters, in order to really function as a loving and caring brother and sister to your members of the church. So I want to encourage you to do that, and then have the discussions, because a lot of times when you discuss things without having that real knowledge of what your fragility is, and a real knowledge of what the depths of racism are, you come off as belittling a really big issue. You come off as giving surface and pat answers to something that is really deep rooted. And that's what you have to become aware of. In the Bible, Paul was very aware of cultural things that were going on around him. If you noticed him when he went to the Roman buildings, he was able to talk about their philosophers. It's in Acts, I believe. He was able to talk about their philosophers. He was able to talk about their pop culture references. He was able to talk about their belief systems, their laws. So even though he was a disciple of Jesus, he didn't ignore the culture and the world around him. In fact, he used those references to better enhance people's understandings of God and religion and Jesus in particular. So people have to become more aware. White people in the church have to become more aware of what's going on with their black brothers and sisters and counterparts. That affects how you treat us here, but it also affects the churches that you plant and the missions that you do overseas, in particular in Africa and in other countries like Cuba or Nicaragua or Venezuela. And all of these countries are hotspot countries right now in the news, and these are mainly black countries, and you have a responsibility to understand the dynamics that black people and then people of color to a lesser extent, but still to an extent, go through, so that you can have the insight and the spirituality to plant churches that are empowering to people and that are not just pacifying people. So I realized quickly that something had to be done. And I plan to do a special. It's going to be called The Cross is Burning. And I want to talk a lot about the Christian church, the power in it, the good things that the church offers, and how to prevent that church from being destroyed from the inside because of racism. The sin of racism is rarely mentioned in churches, and especially in the church that I'm involved with. And so I think there needs to be a really deep discussion and an honest discussion about it. And I plan to do a documentary about it that hopefully will start the conversation. And I know many churches are already doing this, and that's great. I think that this could just be an added addition to those conversations that are happening in those churches. But in the church organization I'm in, there's the conversations have not been, in my opinion, deep enough. And so this piece will add to that. So it's going to be called The Cross is Burning. I'm working on it now. And look forward to it, 2019. And then I'll talk about it some more. Anyway, I better get going. Talk to y'all soon. Peace and love.